Imagine a fighter jet that literally changes its shape in mid-air. A machine that could sprint at twice the speed of sound, carry nuclear weapons, and hunt enemy planes beyond visual range, all while outrunning virtually every aircraft NATO had in the early 1970s. Now, imagine that this same aircraft, despite all of that, was considered by many pilots who flew it as one of the most dangerous machines ever built, not because of the enemies it faced, but because of what it could do to its own pilot. This is the story of the MiG-23 Flogger, the Soviet Union's answer to the West's most capable fighters, a revolutionary machine that divided opinion like no other jet of its era. Some called it a leap forward for Soviet aviation. Others called it an engineering compromise that tried to solve too many problems at once. Both sides were right. Before we go further, let me ask you something. When was the last time you heard about a fighter aircraft that had variable sweep wings, carried radar with look-down, shoot-down capability, could launch missiles from beyond visual range, and was exported to more than 20 countries, all in the same airframe? Probably never. Because the MiG-23 was a unique product of a very specific moment in history, and today we are going to explore every corner of that story. We will cover its origins, the specific technical problems it was designed to solve, its complete set of specifications, its radar and weapon systems, every major variant that entered service, its combat history from the Middle East to Africa, how it compares to its Western equivalents, and what its legacy means for modern aviation. By the end of this video, you will understand not just what the MiG-23 was, but why it mattered, and why it still matters today. Stay with me, because the story starts not with a triumph, but with a crisis. To understand why the MiG-23 existed, you first need to understand what it was replacing and why that replacement was urgently needed. The MiG-21 fishbed was, by any measure, one of the most successful fighter aircraft of the 20th century. Small, fast, agile, and cheap enough to be produced in enormous numbers, the MiG-21 gave the Soviet Union and its allies a formidable frontline interceptor throughout the 1960s. But by the mid-1960s, the MiG-21's fundamental limitations were becoming impossible to ignore. The first and most critical problem was range. The MiG-21 was a point defense interceptor, a machine built to race up to altitude, fire its weapons, and return to base. It had a combat radius of roughly 300 kilometers in a realistic mission profile. That was fine for defending Soviet airspace over the Union itself. But the moment you try to operate the MiG-21 as an offensive air superiority fighter, escorting strike aircraft deep into enemy territory, patrolling contested airspace, or projecting power beyond the Soviet border, its range made it almost useless. The second problem was radar. The MiG-21's RP-21 Sapphire radar was a capable system for its time, but it lacked true look-down, shoot-down capability. What this means in practice is that if an enemy aircraft was flying below you at low altitude, the ground clutter, the radar reflections from terrain, buildings, forests, and roads would effectively blind the system. An enemy pilot who knew he was being hunted by a MiG-21 could simply push his nose down, hug the terrain at low level, and become nearly invisible to the Soviet jet's radar. In the increasingly sophisticated threat environment of the late 1960s, this was not an acceptable limitation. The third problem was weapons. The MiG-21 could carry air-to-air missiles, but its standard armament of R-3S Atoll missiles, essentially Soviet copies of the American AIM-9 Sidewinder, was effective only at short range and required the pilot to approach his target from the rear hemisphere, where the missile's infrared seeker could lock onto the heat of the enemy's engine exhausts. Beyond visual range engagements, where you fire a radar-guided missile at a target you cannot yet see with your eyes, were simply beyond the MiG-21's practical capability in most operational scenarios. The fourth problem was lift performance at low speeds and on takeoff. The MiG-21's highly swept delta wing was excellent at supersonic speeds, giving it low drag and high agility in a turning fight at altitude. But at low speeds, during takeoff and landing, that same wing required very high approach speeds, which meant the aircraft needed long, well-maintained runways and was difficult to operate from austere or damaged airfields. In the Soviet operational doctrine of the time, which anticipated fighting a major land war in Central Europe where airfields would be under constant enemy attack, this was a serious tactical disadvantage. Soviet aviation planners needed something radically different. They needed a fighter that had enough range to escort bombers into the heart of Western Europe, radar powerful enough to detect targets flying below it, missiles that could engage at long range without the need to point the nose directly at the target, and the ability to take off and land from shorter or more degraded runways. The aircraft that emerged from these requirements was unlike anything the Soviet Union had ever built before. The concept of the variable sweep wing, an aircraft whose wings can physically change their angle during flight, was not new in the mid-1960s. American and British engineers had been experimenting with the concept since the early 1950s, recognizing that a wing designed for high-speed flight is fundamentally different in its geometry from a wing designed for low-speed lift and stability. At high speeds, you want a wing that is swept sharply back. This reduces drag by letting the aircraft slip through the air more efficiently, allowing it to reach supersonic speeds without the enormous thrust penalties that a straight wing would impose. But at low speeds, during takeoff, landing, and slow maneuvering, you want a wing that is spread wide and nearly straight. A wider wing generates more lift at lower speeds, which means the aircraft can fly slower before stalling, take off in a shorter distance, and carry heavier payloads. The breakthrough insight of variable sweep wing design is that you do not have to choose between these two configurations. You can have both, as long as you are willing to accept the mechanical complexity of a wing that physically pivots on a structural hinge during flight. The Mikoyan Gurevich Design Bureau received its directive to develop a new generation fighter in the spring of 1965. The primary technical directive was signed on 3rd of June 1965, initiating what would become one of the most ambitious Soviet aircraft development programs of the Cold War era. The designers faced an immediate and fundamental choice. Should the new aircraft use a fixed wing, as the MiG-21 did, or should it use the more complex but potentially far more capable variable sweep configuration? Two parallel prototypes were developed to answer this question. The first was the Yi-2301, an aircraft with a fixed, highly swept delta wing similar in concept to the MiG-21, but much larger and more powerful. The second was the Yi-2311, an aircraft with a variable sweep wing that could pivot between 16 degrees of sweep at its most extended position and 72 degrees at its most highly swept position. The Yi-23-01 flew first, on the 10th of April 1967. It was fast and capable, demonstrating good high-speed performance, but its fixed wing imposed exactly the takeoff and landing limitations that the designers were trying to eliminate. The Yi-2311 followed, and when the two designs were compared in direct evaluation, the variable sweep wing aircraft was clearly superior in its ability to meet all of the operational requirements simultaneously. On 28 May 1967, the Yi-2311 made its public debut at the Moscow Aviation Day air display at Domodedovo Airport. Western military attachés and intelligence analysts who observed the aircraft were stunned. NATO had been aware that the Soviets were developing a new fighter, but the appearance of a variable sweep wing design at this stage of Soviet aviation development represented a genuine leap forward. The aircraft was assigned the NATO reporting name Flogger, and the race to understand its capabilities began immediately. Development was not without serious difficulties. The variable sweep wing system added significant weight and mechanical complexity. The pivot mechanism, which had to withstand enormous aerodynamic loads at high speed and transmit all of the aerodynamic forces of the wing into the aircraft's fuselage, was one of the most challenging engineering problems the Mikoyan Bureau had ever tackled. Early in the test program, there were concerns about the reliability of the pivot bearings under repeated stress cycling, and considerable engineering work was required to bring the system to an acceptable standard of reliability. The engine selection was another major challenge. The aircraft required a power plant that could produce enough thrust to allow supersonic flight while also providing acceptable fuel efficiency during the long-range cruise missions that were central to the MiG-23's operational concept. The Tumansky R-27 turbojet was used in early production aircraft, but it was rapidly replaced in later variants by the more powerful Tumansky R-29 series, which became the definitive engine family for the aircraft. Full-scale production began at the Znamya Truda plant in Moscow in 1970, and the aircraft entered operational service with Soviet frontal aviation units in 1973, initially in the MiG-23M variant. From that moment forward, the MiG-23 became the numerical backbone of Soviet tactical aviation, a role it would maintain for the next 15 years. Let us now get into the raw numbers, because to understand what the MiG-23 was capable of, you need to understand the engineering that made it possible. The MiG-23 is a large aircraft by the standards of its era. In its most common variants, it has an overall length of 16.7 meters, making it nearly 3 meters longer than the MiG-21 it replaced. The fuselage is long and slender, designed to minimize aerodynamic drag at high Mach numbers. The wing sweep is variable, ranging from 16 degrees in the fully forward position, used for takeoff, landing and slow-speed maneuvering, to 45 degrees in an intermediate cruise position, to 72 degrees in the fully swept position used for high-speed supersonic flight. At maximum wing extension, the MiG-23's wingspan reaches 13.97 meters. With the wings fully swept back to 72 degrees, that same wingspan contracts to just 7.78 meters. This dramatic change in wing geometry is the key to the aircraft's ability to operate across such a wide range of flight regimes. The aircraft has a height of 5.0 meters and a wing area that varies significantly with sweep angle, approximately 37.35 square meters, with wings fully forward. The fuselage is built primarily of aluminum alloy, with titanium used in the highest stress areas around the engine bay and the wing pivot mechanism. The construction was designed to be maintainable in field conditions, with most major systems accessible through large access panels along the fuselage sides. The MiG-23 MALD, generally considered the best all-round variant, has an empty weight of approximately 10,200 kilograms. This is substantially heavier than the MiG-21, reflecting both the larger airframe and the heavier systems package. Maximum takeoff weight reaches 20,670 kilograms when carrying a full internal fuel load, plus external weapons and fuel tanks. The aircraft can carry up to 3,000 kilograms of external stores on its 6 hardpoints, though the precise combination of weapons and fuel tanks must be carefully managed to maintain the aircraft's center of gravity within acceptable limits as fuel is consumed. The definitive engine for the MiG-23 series is the Tumansky R-29B 300 turbojet. This is a single-shaft turbojet with an afterburner, representing the culmination of the Tumansky Design Bureau's post-Korean War development work. In dry thrust without the afterburner ignited, the R-29B 300 produces 83.8 kilonewtons of thrust, equivalent to roughly 18,850 pounds of force. With full afterburner engaged, thrust increases dramatically to 127.5 kilonewtons, approximately 28,660 pounds of force. This is a substantial power output for a single engine of this era, and it gives the MiG-23 impressive acceleration performance. The engine's specific fuel consumption is relatively high by modern standards, which is one reason the MiG-23's combat radius with internal fuel only is somewhat limited. In practice, MiG-23 operators routinely carried 1 or 2 external fuel tanks on the centerline and inboard wing hardpoints to extend mission endurance, particularly for escort and patrol missions. At high altitude, with wings fully swept and afterburner engaged, the MiG-23 can reach a maximum speed of approximately Mach 2.35, roughly 2,500 kilometers per hour. This made it one of the fastest fighters in the Soviet inventory at the time of its introduction, capable of overhauling virtually any subsonic or transonic aircraft in a tail chase. At low altitude, where aerodynamic heating and drag impose stricter limits on maximum speed, the aircraft is rated at Mach 1.44, still supersonic, which gives it a significant speed advantage over subsonic attack aircraft it might need to intercept. The service ceiling is listed at approximately 18,500 meters, over 60,000 feet, allowing the aircraft to operate at altitudes beyond the reach of most shoulder-fired and short-range surface-to-air missiles. Combat radius on a standard air superiority mission profile, carrying missiles and 2 external fuel tanks, is approximately 970 kilometers. With a full load of 3 external fuel tanks and reduced weapons load, ferry range extends to approximately 2,820 kilometers, giving the aircraft genuine strategic reach for a tactical fighter of its generation. Rate of climb is approximately 240 meters per second, a figure that puts it among the fastest climbing fighters ever built. Critical for the interceptor role, where time to altitude can be the difference between reaching an enemy bomber before it releases its weapons or arriving too late. Now we get to one of the most critical and often misunderstood aspects of the MiG-23's design: its sensors and weapon systems, which represented a genuine generational leap over the MiG-21. The primary radar fitted to the MiG-23M and subsequent variants is the Sapphire-23, designated RP-23 in Soviet nomenclature and given the NATO reporting name High Lark. This is a pulse Doppler radar, which fundamentally distinguishes it from the simpler pulse radar systems of earlier Soviet fighters. The key capability that pulse Doppler technology provides is the ability to detect targets flying below the radar aircraft against a background of ground clutter. Remember the limitation of the MiG-21's radar we discussed earlier? An enemy aircraft flying at low altitude would be invisible because its radar return was lost in the reflections from the ground. The F-23's pulse Doppler processing can distinguish between the Doppler shift of a moving aircraft and the complex returns from stationary or slowly moving ground objects, giving it genuine look-down, shoot-down capability. Detection range against a typical fighter-sized target at altitude is approximately 85 kilometers. Track range is somewhat shorter, at approximately 60 kilometers. Later variants received progressively improved radar systems. The MiG-23 MLIs introduced the Sapphire-23 MLIs, which offered enhanced look-down capability, improved electronic countermeasures resistance, and better reliability. The MiG-23 MLD, the most capable production variant, carried the Sapphire-23 MLLA, which pushed detection ranges further and improved target tracking in electronic warfare environments. For close-range combat, the MiG-23 carries a single GS-23 Licht twin-barrel 23mm cannon mounted in a semi-retractable pack beneath the forward fuselage. The GS-23L fires at approximately 3,200 rounds per minute, an extremely high rate of fire that compensates for the fact that the weapon only carries around 200 rounds of ammunition in the standard installation. The 23mm round is large enough to cause serious damage to any aircraft with a single hit, and the high rate of fire means that even a brief burst lasting a fraction of a second delivers multiple impacts. The cannon's semi-retractable installation was a compromise. It reduced aerodynamic drag when not in use, but the mechanism added weight and maintenance complexity. The MiG-23's primary beyond visual range weapon is the R-23 missile family, NATO designation AA-7 Apex, which comes in two distinct variants. The R-23R is a semi-active radar homing missile that uses the aircraft's radar to illuminate the target, steering itself toward the reflected energy. It has a maximum range of approximately 35 kilometers under optimal conditions, though practical engagement ranges in combat are considerably shorter, typically 15 to 20 kilometers. The R-23T is an infrared homing variant of the same basic missile which homes on the heat signature of the target's engines. This version does not require the pilot to continue illuminating the target with radar after launch, providing some tactical flexibility. The improved R-24 family, NATO designation AA-7 Apex, later versions, succeeded the R-23 in later MiG-23 variants, extending maximum engagement range to approximately 50 kilometers for the radar-homing R-24R variant. The R-24T infrared variant offered a similarly extended no-escape zone compared to the R-23T. For short-range combat, the MiG-23 carries the R-60 missile, NATO designation AA-AFID. This is a compact, highly agile, infrared-guided missile designed for within-visual range engagements. Its relatively small warhead, just 3.5 kilograms, means it is not always sufficient to destroy a target with a single hit, but its exceptional maneuverability and wide acquisition angle allow the pilot to launch it in situations where earlier generation short-range missiles would have failed to track. The R-60M improved variant added an all-aspect infrared seeker, allowing the pilot to engage targets from any direction rather than being restricted to tail chase attacks. The MiG-23BN and MiG-23B dedicated ground attack variants could carry a wide range of unguided and guided weapons including UB-16 and UB-32 rocket pods, firing 57mm unguided rockets, 100, 250, and 500 kilogram freefall bombs and cluster munitions. The aircraft could also be configured to carry a single tactical nuclear weapon in the B-43 equivalent Soviet configuration, a capability that reflected the aircraft's role as a dual-capable tactical aircraft within the Soviet theater nuclear strike doctrine. The MiG-23 was not a single aircraft, it was a family of continuously evolving designs that spanned more than 2 decades of production and development. Understanding the variants is essential to understanding the aircraft story, because the differences between the earliest and latest versions are substantial. MiG-23S, the initial production variant, entering service in 1969 to 1970, powered by the R-27 F-300 engine and carrying the F-21 radar. This was essentially an interim type, rushed into service to begin training pilots on the variable sweep-wing system while the definitive production aircraft was being refined. It was not considered fully combat-capable and was used almost exclusively for conversion training within the Soviet air forces. MiG-23M, the first fully operational combat variant, entering service in 1973. This introduced the definitive R-29-300 engine, the F-23 radar with genuine look-down capability, and the full complement of R-23 missiles. The MiG-23M was the first Soviet production fighter with beyond visual range engagement capability combined with look-down, shoot-down radar, representing a genuine step change in Soviet air combat capability. It was produced in large numbers and formed the backbone of Soviet frontal aviation for several years. MiG-23MF, an export variant of the MiG-23M, delivered to Warsaw Pact allies including Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. The MiG-23MF carried a slightly downgraded version of the F-23 radar and lacked some of the electronic warfare systems of the full Soviet variant, a deliberate decision to prevent the export of the most sensitive Soviet technologies to allies who might be compromised. MiG-23MS, a further simplified export variant, developed for third-world clients who were considered less politically reliable. The MiG-23MS replaced the F-23 radar with the much simpler F-21 system, the same radar used in the MiG-21, and removed the R-23 missile capability entirely, limiting the aircraft to short-range R-3S and R-60 missiles. This substantially reduced the aircraft's combat capability while making it cheaper, simpler to maintain, and, critically from the Soviet perspective, incapable of performing many of the missions that would reveal the full capabilities of the Soviet weapons system. MiG-23 MALs, introduced in 1976, this was the first truly major upgrade to the basic design. The ML designation stands for Lyogi lightweight, reflecting a significant effort to reduce the aircraft's empty weight by approximately 1,250 kilograms through structural redesign and the removal of some systems. The ML introduced the improved F-23 mm radar, a new fire control computer, and provision for the improved R-24 missile family. Perhaps most significantly, the reduced weight dramatically improved the aircraft's agility at low and medium speeds, addressing one of the persistent criticisms of earlier variants. The MiG-23 MLLs was the first variant that many Soviet pilots considered genuinely competitive with contemporary Western fighters in close-range combat. MiG-23 MLA, a minor upgrade of the ML introducing the improved F-23 MLA radar and updated electronic warfare systems. Externally virtually identical to the ML, the MLA is difficult to distinguish without access to the aircraft's documentation. MiG-23 MELD, generally considered the definitive air superiority variant and the best all-round version of the MiG-23 family. The D suffix stands for Dorabotany, refined or improved. The MLD introduced aerodynamic refinements including a new leading-edge root extension, a strake added to the wing root that substantially improved low-speed handling and departure resistance, and a revised automatic wing sweep schedule that provided more intuitive handling. Characteristics: the F-23 MLA-2 radar offered improved performance in electronic warfare environments, and the aircraft gained the ability to carry the R-73 close combat missile, one of the most agile short-range missiles ever built, later in its service life. Soviet pilots who flew the MLD compared its low-speed agility favorably with the early F-16, which was high praise given the F-16's reputation as the standard setter for close combat performance. MiG-23B and MiG-23BN. These are dedicated ground attack variants developed in parallel with the air superiority family. The MiG-23B introduced a redesigned forward fuselage with a downward angled nose to improve forward visibility during low-level attack runs, a laser rangefinder, and new navigation and weapons delivery systems optimized for the ground attack role. The BN was an improved version exported widely to third-world clients. Both variants retained the variable sweep wing but removed the air-to-air radar, replacing it with a terrain-following system. MiG-23UB, the two-seat conversion trainer variant, retaining the combat capability of the single-seat aircraft while adding a second cockpit for instructor use. The UB is unique among MiG-23 variants in retaining a fixed wing derived from the basic design, sacrificing the variable sweep to accommodate the additional cockpit volume. Despite this limitation, the UB served extensively throughout the MiG-23's operational life and continues in limited use today. Export variants, MiG-23P and others. The Soviet Air Defense Forces operated the MiG-23P variant, optimized for the pure interceptor role against high-altitude bombers and cruise missiles. Various other national designations were applied to aircraft delivered to the more than 20 countries that operated the type, including Syria, Libya, Algeria, Ethiopia, Cuba, India, Iraq, North Korea, and several others. The scale of MiG-23 production reflects the central role the aircraft played in Soviet and Warsaw Pact aviation throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Total production figures are estimated at approximately 5,047 aircraft of all variants, making the MiG-23 the most numerous variable sweep wing aircraft ever built by a significant margin. To put this in perspective, the American F-14 Tomcat, the U.S. Navy's own variable sweep wing fighter, was produced in a total of 712 aircraft. The MiG-23 outnumbered it by more than 7-1. Production was concentrated at the Znamia Truda plant in Moscow, with additional assembly at other Soviet facilities. At peak production in the mid-1970s, output reached several hundred aircraft per year, reflecting the Soviet military's emphasis on numerical strength and the ability to sustain high attrition rates in a major conflict. Export pricing for the MiG-23 varied significantly by variant and recipient. For Warsaw Pact allies, aircraft were typically supplied at favorable pricing as part of broader military assistance agreements. For third world clients paying in convertible currency, the basic MiG-23MX was priced at approximately 3.6 to 4.5 million in late 1970s values. The more capable MiG-23MF commanded prices in the range of US 5.5 to 6.6 million. The full Soviet standard MiG-23MLs and MLD variants were not generally sold at openly quoted prices, as they contained sensitive technology, but estimates suggest export pricing in the range of $8 to $12 million per aircraft in equivalent period values. For comparison, the American F-16A Fighting Falcon, which entered service at approximately the same time as the MiG-23 MLLs, had a unit flyaway cost of approximately $14.6 million in fiscal year 1978 dollars. The MiG-23 was thus competitive on price for the export market, particularly for clients who had limited foreign exchange reserves and needed large numbers of aircraft rather than smaller quantities of more sophisticated and expensive Western types. Operating costs were relatively high compared to simpler aircraft like the MiG-21. The variable sweep wing system required regular maintenance on the pivot bearings and the interconnecting drive mechanism that ensured both wings swept symmetrically. The R-29 engine was powerful but thirsty, and its time between overhauls was shorter than comparable Western engines, increasing the cost per flight hour. For wealthier operators in the Soviet sphere, these costs were manageable. For some third world operators with limited maintenance infrastructure and spare parts availability, the MiG-23 proved to be a demanding aircraft to keep in operational condition. This is where the MiG-23's story truly comes alive in the crucible of actual combat, where the aircraft's capabilities and limitations were tested not on paper or in test ranges, but against real enemies firing real weapons. The MiG-23 first saw combat in Syrian hands following the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when the Soviet Union rapidly resupplied Syria with large numbers of advanced aircraft. Syrian MiG-23 MS aircraft flew patrol missions over Lebanese airspace in 1974, and the type was involved in the complex series of aerial engagements that took place over Lebanon between 1979 and 1982. Syrian pilots flying MiG-23 MS aircraft, the downgraded export version, it must be emphasized, encountered Israeli Air Force aircraft on multiple occasions. The results were heavily influenced by the significant capability differential between the export MS variant and the full Soviet standard aircraft, but the engagements provided valuable tactical data. The Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, beginning in December 1979, saw MiG-23 aircraft operating from bases inside Afghanistan and from Soviet territory, providing air support to ground forces engaged in counterinsurgency operations. In this role, the MiG-23 operated primarily as a fast ground attack aircraft, using its speed to minimize exposure to the increasingly sophisticated air defenses that the Mujahideen acquired as the war progressed. The introduction of the American-supplied FIM-92 Stinger man-portable infrared missile in 1986 significantly complicated MiG-23 operations, as it did for all Soviet aircraft in Afghanistan. The Stinger's all-aspect infrared seeker could engage aircraft from any direction, not just from the rear, and its speed and maneuverability made it a serious threat even to fast jet aircraft executing high-speed attack runs. Soviet and Afghan Air Force pilots adapted their tactics, increasing attack altitudes and reducing loiter time over target areas, which reduced accuracy but improved survival rates. The Afghanistan campaign revealed important maintenance lessons. The dusty environment accelerated wear in the variable sweep wing pivot mechanism and in the engine compressor blades. Soviet maintenance units adapted their servicing schedule significantly during the war, developing improved inspection procedures that were later incorporated into standard maintenance doctrine. Of all the MiG-23's combat deployments, the operations over Angola in 1987 and 1988 provide the most detailed and strategically significant case study of the aircraft's capabilities, and this is where the story gets particularly interesting. By 1987, the Angolan Civil War had become a major Cold War proxy conflict, with Soviet and Cuban forces supporting the MPLA government against UNITA rebels backed by South Africa and the United States. The South African Air Force, the SAF, was flying the Dassault Mirage F-14, a highly capable French-designed fighter, in support of South African Defense Force ground operations inside Angola. The SAF Mirage F-14 pilots were among the best trained and most experienced combat aviators in Africa, and their aircraft were equipped with sophisticated avionics and weapon systems. Cuba deployed a significant number of MiG-23 Melidal aircraft to Angola to counter the SAF's air superiority advantage. Critically, and this distinction matters enormously, these were genuine Soviet-standard MiG-23 Melidal aircraft, not the downgraded export variants. Cuban pilots operating these aircraft had received training in the Soviet Union and were familiar with the full capabilities of the Sapphire-23 MLRS radar and the R-23 and R-24 missile systems. The first major aerial engagement between MiG-23 Emilitas and Mirage F-1s occurred on 10 September 1987, when Cuban MiG-23s intercepted a formation of SAF Mirages operating over southeastern Angola. The MiG-23 pilots used their radar's look-down capability to detect the Mirages at ranges beyond visual range and launched R-60 Mk missiles in a close-range engagement. Following the initial detection, the Mirages were forced to disengage, unable to counter the MiG-23's combination of radar capability and missile armament effectively. On 27 September 1987, a larger engagement involving 3 pairs of SAF Mirage F-1s encountered Cuban MiG-23 MELs in a complex series of maneuvers. The tactical results of this engagement remain debated by historians, but the strategic outcome was clear. The SAF was no longer able to operate with impunity over Angolan airspace. The engagement of 25 November 1987 was particularly significant. SAF Mirages attempted a strike on the strategic base at Menong using Kentron H-2 Raptor standoff weapons, but the weapons failed to release cleanly, and Cuban MiG-23 millilethal interceptors arrived to contest the attack. The attack was not completed as planned. The engagement of 29 November 1987 saw SAF Mirages successfully attack Menong airfield, destroying 3 MiG-23 MLRs on the ground and shooting down 2 more that attempted to intercept during takeoff. This demonstrated that the MiG-23 remained vulnerable when caught at low speed during the takeoff phase, a fundamental limitation that no amount of in-flight performance could overcome. However, by early 1988, the overall air superiority picture had shifted decisively in favor of the Cuban-flown MiG-23 MELs. The SAF was compelled to restrict its operations to night missions at very low altitude, where the MiG-23's radar advantage was partially neutralized. The fact that South Africa went to the length of acquiring a different missile system to counter the MiG-23 Meliels is perhaps the most compelling testament to the aircraft's effectiveness in this theater. By the middle of 1988, Cuban and Angolan forces had achieved effective air superiority over the contested southeastern regions of Angola. This air superiority played a direct role in the negotiations that eventually led to the tripartite agreement of December 1988, under which South Africa withdrew its forces from Angola and Namibia. The MiG-23 Meliels had won its most strategically significant air campaign. Iraqi Air Force MiG-23s were among the most active users of the type in combat during the Iran-Iraq War. Iraq operated a mix of MiG-23 MS, MiG-23 MF, and MiG-23BN variants, using them across the full spectrum of air-to-air and air-to-ground missions. Iraqi MiG-23 pilots claimed a number of kills against Iranian aircraft during the war, though independent verification of specific engagements is difficult. The war demonstrated the operational challenges of operating the MiG-23 in a sustained high-intensity conflict with imperfect maintenance infrastructure. Iraqi aircraft suffered from serviceability problems that reduced the proportion of the fleet available for operations at any given time, a reflection of the maintenance demands of the variable sweep-wing system in conditions that did not match Soviet peacetime standards. Let us now set the MiG-23 against its primary Western contemporaries and assess honestly where it was superior, where it was inferior, and where it was broadly equivalent. MiG-23 versus F-4 Phantom II. The McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II was the primary Western multi-role fighter against which the MiG-23 was measured for much of its early operational life. The comparison is interesting because the two aircraft represent fundamentally different design philosophies. The F-4 was heavier, maximum takeoff weight around 28,000 kilograms versus the MiG-23's 20,670 kilograms, and was powered by two engines rather than one, giving it greater engine-out safety margins and total thrust. The F-4's APQ.120 radar offered broadly comparable detection range to the SAPFR-23, with both systems having genuine look-down capability in their later variants. Both aircraft carried long-range radar-guided missiles, the AIM-7 Sparrow on the F-4 versus the R-23 on the MiG-23, with broadly similar performance parameters. Where the MiG-23 held clear advantages was in maximum speed, Mach 2.35, versus the F-4's Mach 2.23, and in its lower wing loading at similar gross weights, which in principle should have given it better sustained turn performance. Where the F-4 held advantages was in crew composition. The two-pilot weapons system officer crew provided enhanced situational awareness and workload management in complex combat environments, and in overall systems reliability. In practice, the F-4 variants that most commonly faced the MiG-23 in export operator conflicts were older and less capable than the most advanced contemporary versions, which distorts any direct comparison. Having examined the MiG-23's design, specifications, variants, combat history, and competitive position, we can now assess its genuine strengths clearly and honestly. The first and most fundamental strength is the variable sweep wing itself, which, despite its mechanical complexity, genuinely solved the problem it was designed to address. The ability to take off from short or damaged runways in the forward swept wing configuration and then race to the target area at Mach 2+, in the fully swept configuration, was exactly what Soviet operational requirements demanded. No fixed-wing aircraft of the period could match this combination of field performance and top-end speed. The second strength is the radar and missile system. The SAPFR-23's look-down, shoot-down capability and the R-23RR-24 missile family gave the MiG-23 a genuine beyond visual range engagement capability that was years ahead of most of its export competition and comparable to the best Western systems of the early 1970s. In Angola, this combination proved strategically decisive. The third strength is the aircraft's speed. At Mach 235, the MiG-23 is genuinely fast. Fast enough to run away from any engagement it does not want to fight, fast enough to intercept subsonic targets from any angle, and fast enough to make effective use of the standoff range advantage of its radar-guided missiles. Speed is a tactical multiplier, and the MiG-23 had it in abundance. The fourth strength is production volume and export success. With over 5,000 aircraft produced and more than 20 operator nations, the MiG-23 was an enormously successful export product that provided the Soviet Union with political influence, foreign currency earnings, and an enormous base of operational experience. The quantity of aircraft produced also meant that spare parts and trained maintenance personnel were widely available, reducing the logistical burden on operators. The fifth strength is cost-effectiveness. At $3 to $5 million per aircraft in period values for the basic export variants, the MiG-23 offered beyond visual range radar and missile capability at a price point accessible to third world air forces that could never have afforded equivalent Western technology. For many of its 20-plus operator nations, the MiG-23 was the most capable aircraft they could realistically acquire, and it provided genuine deterrent and combat capability. Honesty requires an equally clear assessment of the MiG-23's genuine weaknesses, of which there were several that proved operationally significant. The most fundamental weakness was low-speed maneuverability. In the turning engagements that have characterized close-range air combat since World War I, the MiG-23 was at a disadvantage against lighter, more agile opponents in the visual range environment. Early variants, in particular, were described by many pilots as positively dangerous at high angles of attack and low speeds, with abrupt departure characteristics that could lead rapidly to unrecoverable spins. The MiG-23 MiL-D addressed this partially through its leading-edge route extension, but the aircraft never matched the close-range agility of dedicated air superiority fighters like the F-16 or the later MiG-29. The second major weakness was accident rate. The MiG-23 earned a reputation as a demanding aircraft that punished mistakes harshly. Its departure characteristics at high angles of attack, combined with handling qualities that required careful management of the automatic wing sweep schedule, resulted in accident rates that were higher than the Soviet air forces would have preferred. A number of unusual incidents added to this reputation, including the well-publicized 1989 incident in which an unpiloted MiG-23 flew from Poland across Eastern Europe and into Belgium before running out of fuel and crashing. The pilot had ejected over Poland when the engine failed to restart, but the aircraft had leveled out and continued flying autonomously at reduced power. The third major weakness was the engine's specific fuel consumption, which limited combat radius without external fuel tanks and required careful fuel management on longer missions. The R-29's time between overhauls was also shorter than desired, increasing operating costs and maintenance burden. The fourth weakness was the complexity of the variable sweep wing mechanism in field conditions. While Soviet maintenance units adapted to servicing the system effectively, the pivot bearings and drive mechanism required regular attention that was beyond the capacity of some export operators with limited maintenance infrastructure. Aircraft that were not maintained to standard could develop handling asymmetries as the two wings began to respond differently to sweep commands, a safety-critical issue that required immediate grounding and corrective maintenance. The fifth weakness was that the export variants, which accounted for a large proportion of total operators, were significantly less capable than the Soviet standard aircraft. The MiG-23 MS, stripped of its Sapphire-23 radar and R-23 missiles, lost the two most important capability advantages that distinguished the MiG-23 from its predecessors. Export operators who received these simplified versions found themselves with an aircraft that was large, complex, and expensive to operate compared to the MiG-21, but without the radar and missile capability that justified this additional complexity. We have now covered the complete story of the MiG-23, and it is time to draw the threads together into a coherent verdict. The MiG-23 was a product of a specific historical moment, a period in which the Soviet Union recognized that the MiG-21's fundamental limitations could not be solved through incremental refinement, and that a new generation of aircraft with fundamentally different capabilities was required. The designers who responded to this challenge created an aircraft that was genuinely revolutionary in several respects: the variable sweep wing, the look-down, shoot-down radar, the beyond visual range missile system, and the combination of high speed with acceptable field performance. In the air, the MiG-23 delivered real operational capability in the roles it was designed for. Over Angola, flown by well-trained pilots in the proper Soviet standard configuration, it achieved genuine air superiority against capable opponents and influenced the strategic outcome of a major conflict. That is the ultimate test of any combat aircraft, and the MiG-23 passed it. But the MiG-23 was also a machine of compromises. The variable sweep wing that gave it tactical versatility also gave it mechanical complexity. The large radar that gave it beyond visual range capability also gave it weight and fuel consumption that limited its agility and range. The speed that made it a formidable interceptor made it less competitive in the close-range turning fights where many real air combats were decided. History has been somewhat unkind to the MiG-23's reputation, primarily because the aircraft's export record heavily weighted toward the simplified, downgraded MS and MF variants, presented a misleadingly negative picture of its true capabilities. Aircraft that lacked the F-23 radar and R-23 missiles, operated by pilots with limited training, naturally performed poorly against well-equipped and well-trained Western opponents. The conclusion that the MiG-23 was simply an inferior aircraft does not survive honest examination of the evidence. Over Angola, the full capability variant, flown well, proved highly effective. More than 5,000 MiG-23s were built. They served with more than 20 air forces on every inhabited continent except Australia. In many of those air forces, they remain in service today, their variable wings still sweeping back and forward as they operate from airfields that are a long way from the design bureau in Moscow, where Mikhail Gurevich and his team worked out the geometry of a wing that could change its shape. That is the legacy of the Flogger. A machine that changed the rules of what a Soviet fighter could do, that proved its worth in the most demanding operational conditions, and that served for half a century because it offered something that no simpler design could match. Not perfection, but a combination of capabilities that no other aircraft of its generation could replicate at its price point. And that combination, ultimately, is what defines a successful weapons system. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think the MiG-23 gets a fair evaluation in most Western aviation histories? Does its performance over Angola change your assessment of where it fits in the rankings of Cold War fighters? Leave your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. If this video gave you a deeper understanding of one of the Cold War's most complex and underrated fighters, hit the like button right now. It makes an enormous difference to how many people see this content. Subscribe if you're not already, because this channel goes deeper on military aviation than anywhere else on YouTube. And if you want to go further right now, the next video is already waiting for you. The story continues.